Hello everyone and welcome to the HEAS Podcast. This is episode 10. I'm delighted to be here today. My name is Tom Higham and I'm the head of HEAS. And today we've got two fascinating guests who've recently come to Vienna to give us seminars. The first of whom is Professor Kate Britton. And she's an archaeological scientist from the University of Aberdeen in the UK. And she's an expert in stable isotope geochemistry, particularly isotopes such as carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, strontium, and more. And these are really important isotopes because they help to unlock the past environment, the past paleo diet, and all sorts of other interesting things regarding human adaptation and prehistory. The second guest we have today is Professor Dennis Wilken. He's from the Christian Albrechts University in Kiel. And he is an expert in geophysical surveying, particularly under the sea and under the oceans, and finding evidence from archaeological pasts to do with shipwrecks and the undersea world. He studied shipwrecks in Greece and Turkey, Iceland, Greenland, and many more places, exploring the remains of human history under the sea. So join our host today, Victoria Oberreiter, and her two fascinating guests as we explore this edition of the HEAS Podcast. Keep being curious, and we'll see you again on many of our seminars that we have here at HEAS. And also, just a reminder, at the very bottom of this podcast and this link, you'll find a connection to the seminars and also to some of the publications of our guests. See you next time.
Welcome, Kate, to the HEAS Podcast. We're so happy to have you today. You're gonna talk us through your research today. So let's start with who you are and what your job is.
So my name is Kate Britton. I'm a professor of archaeological science at the University of Aberdeen, which is in Scotland.
Very important to mention because somebody was like, oh, England. I was like, not really. Yeah. Your field of expertise is stable isotopes, stable isotope analysis of ancient remains. Could you explain how this technique works? And let's start by please explain what stable isotopes even are.
So, the periodic table, we can start with that. So the periodic table of the elements. So different elements have different versions. This is the easiest way of thinking about it. So carbon, for example, there's 3 different versions of carbon. C14 is the one archaeologists will have heard of, right? It's the backbone of radiocarbon dating, but there are other isotopes of carbon as well, carbon-12 and carbon-13. So what isotope analysis does is determine the ratio of the different isotopes of, for example, carbon in bodily tissues. And some of those tissues can be preserved for a really long time in the archaeological record. Things like bone collagen, which is a protein we extract from bone. Now, when we determine those signatures can tell us something about the animal or the person and the life that they led. And this is because isotopes function differently in different chemical and biological reactions. These are the reactions that are all around us in the natural world. And what that produces is variation. And that variation can lead to signatures that can tell us something very specific about, say, the dietary history of an individual. And if we can relate those signatures that we understand from variability within the natural world to those signatures within the remains of a long dead individual or an animal, that can then tell us something about what they did during their lives. In essence, isotope analysis, you are what you eat, and sometimes you are where you ate it.
So I was going to ask you which materials can be analyzed.
So I already mentioned bone collagen, and bone collagen is a structural protein. So collagen is a really important part of your body. You'd literally fall apart without it. It's can be extracted from bones. It's often preserved. The dense mineral matrix of bone preserves it. We extract it. And that's what we analyze. And that can tell you about proteins consumed during life, which can give you an indication of diet. When we extract collagen, it's sort of like, actually, did you ever make like a soup or a stew where the next day, are you a vegetarian? Sorry, is this going to be a disgusting thing to say?
No, I'm not vegetarian. Actually, see this? I have my collagen drink in this, so.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's probably marine peptides, which is essentially fish goop, or possibly beef collagen. But cheers. So if you ever made a soup or a stew and the next day it was kind of wobbly, You know, when it goes like jelly,
I know exactly what
you
you mean.
made collagen, and that's what we're doing in the lab, and that's what they're doing to make your collagen drink.
Also gummy bears, isn't it?
Gummy bears, exactly. It's why things like gummy bears are not always suitable for vegetarians. And that process we do in our lab, but with less gravy. So we're not making stew. We demineralize the bones, we extract the collagen, and we analyze that. For different isotope systems, you can also analyze the mineral phases of the skeleton. So the hard parts of teeth, for example, the enamel. And some isotope approaches, if we're lucky enough to find things like hair and fingernails in the archaeological record, which isn't too unusual, we can also perform isotope analysis on those as well.
How long are these structures like nails or hair? How long can they be preserved?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, it really depends on the burial environment. So things like really cold temperatures, like in permafrost, that inhibit bacterial action, can keep those tissues preserved for sometimes millennia. I mean, we've all seen news stories of, bits of mammoths defrosting from permafrost and what have you, with their hair still intact and blood still in their veins. Conversely, very warm places can also conserve soft tissues. So classically, we think of things like Egyptian mummies that can be preserved for thousands of years because they're essentially being dried. And it's all about conditions that inhibit bacterial activity. So sort of warm and wet environments are the worst for preserving organics.
Now, having learned all that, and now that we understand how this method works, can you tell us about one interesting finding or result that you've achieved using this method?
Ooh, I guess what's interesting to me tends to be quite geeky and specific methodologically. Interesting for other people. That's the tricky bit. Well, I can tell you about a very recent case study, something that we've worked on, where it actually wasn't isotopes, where we were determining vitamin D levels in human hair, which is something we've been working on to do. Because typically, vitamin D status in the past is determined by looking at skeletal markers, but we're trying to see if we can actually empirically look at vitamin D status. And we've been analyzing it in human hair from a site in Aberdeen. And we were able to determine the vitamin D levels, but we wanted to correlate it with season. And some of the isotopes that we look at can tell us about seasonality. And in this particular individual, we sequentially sampled his hair. So that's chopping the hair into little bits, which gives you a time series of dietary inputs. So we were able to look at the isotopes for his diet to see that he liked to eat a little bit of fish. We were able to see vitamin D levels. They were pretty similar to people today in Aberdeen, which is perhaps not surprising. It's a similar latitude. But we were also able to look at those seasonal isotope indicators. And in this individual, because the hair was sampled from the skull, we could see that he died in springtime, which is quite crazy because there's very few methods archaeologically where you can actually get season of death. And this was a really nice and surprising result.
That's indeed really cool. And it reminds me of like medical detectives, but with ancient remains. So,
Yeah.
where they go back and then they cut the hair in like pieces and can track back when the person was intoxicated or something.
Exactly. These methods, so that the methods that we're using for the vitamin D extraction are essentially based on the kinds of studies that forensics and people trying to detect when their employees are doing drugs or what have you, and they sample their hair.
That would be quite invasive.
Well, I think
your hair.
Yeah. So we're looking for metabolites of vitamin D, but people use it for looking at metabolites of drugs as well, in forensic cases and criminal cases.
You've mentioned that you can use stable isotopes for understanding dietary habits, but I've read in your publication record that you can also use it to reconstruct past climates.
Yeah.
Could you explain that for us, please?
Oh, yes. So I already mentioned the seasonality indicators that were in that individual's hair. We can also get the same information from the teeth of some animals as well. So this works really, really well in horses because they have really big teeth and they're obligate drinkers. That means they have to drink a lot of liquid, right? They don't just get their water from their food, for example. And we know that, from modern studies, we know that the oxygen isotope ratio of local rainfall is related to the local climate. And if we have an animal that's an obligate drinker and it's drinking water from that local environment, that signature of that local water should be preserved within tissues that grow incrementally. So that means sort of bit by bit, like layers of an onion. And horse teeth grow in that manner, or very similar to that manner. And we can sequentially sample those teeth, and we can extract oxygen isotope ratios all the way down that front of tooth growth, and to see what the temperature was like in summer and what the temperature was like in winter. So if you like, the little horse is then being used almost as a kind of paleothermometer to tell us about temperatures at that site. And the cool thing about this method, obviously we have other means of reconstructing seasonal climate or temperature in the past, but where we're dealing with sites where the horses are in the record because maybe Neanderthals or modern humans have butchered them, they've hunted them and killed them, that means that small little pocket of climatic information is directly related to human action during which the time with which the site was being occupied. So it's that relation to, it's creating a kind of insight, a window into climate on the level of a sort of human life, which makes it so exciting for archaeologists.
Okay, let's move into our listener questions, which I've told you before. This time I haven't collected on social media, but from my friends actually. So, as you mentioned, Neanderthals and their behavior, that they might have been butchering the animals that you analyze, I'm going to ask you this question now. Can stable isotopes be used to track Neanderthal dietary behavior? And would you expect dietary differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens?
Well, that's a really good question. It's not something I've worked on personally, but there's actually a great deal written on this. So you can look up the work of Mike Richards or Hervé Bocheron on this topic. And indeed, yes, you can. So people have extracted collagen from Neanderthals, from modern humans, Upper Paleolithic modern humans. They've examined their diets. And one of the main conclusions that's come from the isotopes is that Neanderthals really enjoyed their meat, which is perhaps no surprising. There was some work that suggested dietary differences towards the when we have Upper Paleolithic modern humans in Europe, maybe more fish consumption has been argued with them. So maybe slight dietary differences, but I think there's probably not enough data, and nor is it necessarily ideal to kind of posture Neanderthals versus modern humans in terms of dietary differences. I think more often the differences that we see are a function of the time and space that the individuals are living in, because we've got to remember, Neanderthals were living in a vast area that would have had different sort of ecosystems to eat within. And certainly from some of the dental calculus work, we know Neanderthals ate plants as well. So it's, we get one picture from the isotopes, but that picture is time and place specific, is my interpretation of the work that's been done by others. But I want to stress none of that was done by me. But yeah, you absolutely can. And I think the isotopes have yielded some really interesting things.
As you said, even if you would compare different Neanderthal population to one another, that would probably lead to different results because of spatial.
Absolutely. We've got to remember Neanderthals lived for tens of thousands of years across a massive range, very different biomes, ecosystems that they were functioning in. Yeah. And I think I always urge caution when it comes to sort of Neanderthals always did this, or because in the same way that we can't say, humans always do this. If you compare how, say, a Viking site to a Western desert site in Australia, right? Both human sites, but very different lives, very different ways of being. And there's no reason why sort of Neanderthals were one homogeneous mass of way of being, just like modern humans.
Even within the same population, also with modern humans, one, as you mentioned, is a vegetarian, and the other person right next to the other person is not. So that's also the beauty of stable isotope analysis, because you can see differences between populations and then plot it on a lovely PCA and then see what people ate and probably where they grew up or where they came from. If one is, I think you can do that, right? If one person is not from this same area, you can see that in the isotope results.
Absolutely. So, that's the beautiful thing with isotopes. You can build, big population level stories. You can do a lot of, say, carbon, nitrogen, dietary analysis, and you can say what the general diet was like in this space or time. You can also look at mobility. So that would again be targeting the mineral rather than the collagen normally. And strontium isotope analysis is the approach you'd use for that, often combined with oxygen to help you sort of pin down where someone might have grown their teeth when they were a child. I will say that's rather than came from, but that's what's being recorded in the tooth enamel. So that can tell you about childhood origin, essentially. But the beautiful thing with isotopes is you can do these on a kind of broad scale. You can get lots of data and pool it together. Or you can tell these wonderful individual stories, you know, an individual person. So what their diet was like as an adult from their bone collagen, what their diet was like as a child from their dentinal collagen, which is in their teeth. You can look at their enamel to see where they came from. And you can even look at multiple teeth to see if there was movement throughout childhood or dietary change throughout childhood. So you can build these lovely isotope biographies, if you like, of individuals. But then you can also magnify those data up and try to gain broad insights into what, say, medieval diet was like in Scotland, or what Viking diet was like in Scandinavia, or indeed what Neanderthal diet was like.
So to recap, you can target different materials in the body, and depending on their time of formation, you can tell where they've been during the time of formation of that material.
Yes, absolutely. And that's
amazing.
And that's the key thing, is having sort of knowledge of the different tissue formation times. So knowing that, that one particular tooth forms during, say, the age of 3 and 6 years old, you've got to know that you're getting isotope information about that period and not about adulthood, but then comparing it to adulthood data you might get from another part of the skeleton. And that kind of, when you're designing a study, what materials you have, what tooth you're dealing with, all of that's really, really key. You can't just, sample a range of different teeth, say, for example, from different individuals, and then try and cross-compare them if they're not all the same tooth, because it represents a different time period. You're comparing apples and oranges if you do that.
All right, let's move on to our second listener question. Given your expertise in paleodietary reconstruction, how closely does the modern paleo diet, the Instagram diet, reflect the actual diets of ancient people? And are there common misconceptions?
That's a really interesting question, and one I have some personal experience of, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So to answer in general, I think the paleo diet, I haven't studied it closely, but essentially says we should avoid anything that's kind of farmed, intensively produced, so out with wheat, out with farmed, dairy, et cetera. And I would say a diet of kind of natural foods and cutting out heavily processed food, that sounds pretty healthy to me. In terms of the paleo diet that is, all over Instagram and full of, coconut water and avocados and almonds, we did a little experiment, me and my friends who I work with in the department in Aberdeen. We wanted to have a paleo-meso dinner party, right? But only of foods that would be found in Scotland during the Paleolithic and Mesolithic. And this... and we decided, first of all, that we were allowed, it was February, so we did out with seasonality to begin with, otherwise we wouldn't have been eating anything. So we decided, okay, no seasonality, we were allowed that, but we had to be true to geography. But it turned out all those useful paleo recipes online that have almonds and avocados don't grow so well in Scotland. So we found it really difficult to translate. And interestingly, one of the hardest things to fill, I suppose not surprisingly, was carbohydrates. So with the exception of, I think we let ourselves have parsnip chips, everything else was heavy on the protein and heavy on the sort of berries and watercress and things like this, and sea herbs. We were allowed samphire and things like this, and lots of salmon. But yeah, it was very, very tricky. And all those paleo diet recipes that I guess reflect what is achievable in somewhere like California, it's definitely not achievable in Northwest Europe.
Yeah, I love the avocados. They're always present in those recipes. But of course, it depends on where you're currently at.
I would say at more northerly latitudes, it's quite normal. If we look at dietary diversity in contemporary and recent historic hunter-gatherer populations, and we see very high quantities of animal products. But again, the idea of sort of a nice lean fillet or so being the appealing part is something that, I guess we might consider. But really, it's things like bone marrow that would be super essential. So fats. Yeah. As opposed to, a nice little lean bit of venison and what have you. Nutritionally, it's not offering you as much. But yeah, I think we tend to, because it's obvious from the faunal record that we have overrepresentation of big bovids. We don't get things like fish bone very often. And for sure, those would have been really important resources as well as plants that, again, super unrepresented unless we use some quite diverse means to see them, things like the dental calculus analysis, which I don't do, but I'm super excited by, to try and see those kind of invisible or hard to see dietary components.
So overall, by the way, I love the experiment that you guys did.
It was fun and tasty research. So
yeah. Let's move on to the HEAS quick takes. That's a rapid fire question round, and let's see how quick you can answer those.
Okay, yikes.
Which aspect of your job do you enjoy the most?
Oh, the research and meeting people.
Which music do you like?
Oh, awful music. I'm forced to listen to a lot of Taylor Swift because I have a 6-year-old at the moment. But actually, I quite like that. So, yeah. Does that make me a Swiftie? Is that what they call them?
Yes, I don't know. I only know, we just talked about this weekend. I only know the few common songs that are popular here in Austria. I think in the US, it's a totally different story.
Yeah. Well, my kid seems to have picked them all up from somewhere. But yeah, there could be worse things to listen to. So,
That's true.
3 words your students probably would describe you with.
Loud and disorganized and probably a little bit cheeky.
Love that. Who was the first scientist that inspired you?
I don't know if this question counts, and I'm sorry, this is supposed to be quick fire, but I went to visit, and I don't think as a scientist, but I can say archaeologist who inspired me, or archaeological performance practitioner who inspired me. I went to Creswell Crags, which was a archaeological site in England as I must have been about a 7-year-old. And there was one of the guides was dressed up full blown as a caveman and showed us how to make fire. And that singularly was my kind of, wow, there is a deep time moment as a sort of 7-year-old. So does that count as answering your question?
Totally. I love that. As a 7-year-old, you were like, wow.
I know.
If you could change one thing in your field, what would it be?
More women.
Love that as well. The next segment is called Speakers Ask Speakers. It's one question that a previous guest on this podcast has left for you. And the question is, if you had a time machine and could travel back to meet your 18-year-old self, what advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I guess there's a range of things, right? Academic, personal, etc. I think I look back then and about how much I cared about what people thought, right? And I'm not saying you should be discourteous or you should neglect other people's needs, but caring more about how you feel and about yourself, well, taking care of people's needs, but not caring so much about what people think, being not afraid of saying what you think and of being less of a people pleaser, maybe.
I'm so there with you. It took me a really long time to really learn that. You don't have to be an asshole. Just try to be a decent human person, but still, stay true to yourself. Mm-hmm. It's, I don't know, the way we grew up, like as millennials, I feel like there was so much focus being put on the perception from outside that it kind of formed us that way. But I feel like it's time to move away from too much of people pleasing. I totally agree with that.
So where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at, is it called X now though, isn't it? Yes, I'm on X at whatKTdigs. And that's pretty much it.
That's a great username. And Kate, is there anything you feel like I didn't ask you today, anything you would like to add?
No, I think I'm fine.
So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to sit down with me for the HEAS podcast.
Thank you. That was good fun.
Hi, Dennis, and welcome to the HEAS podcast.
Hi.
I'm excited to chat with you today because you have a really cool job. So could you please introduce yourself and what you do for a living?
Yeah, I'm Dennis Wilken. I work in Kiel University as a researcher, and I am looking for archaeological features underground and underwater.
So you're using geophysical methods to investigate archaeological questions. One of the many exciting things you can uncover with these methods are ancient ships, as you've already mentioned in your talk today. For someone who has no idea how that works, like me, could you please explain how that is done?
That is usually done by so-called acoustic methods, which is kind of a fish finding sonar, which probably most of us have already seen, or seismic methods, which work like, well, sonographic devices. So you have all seen a sonographic image of a baby, the fetus or whatever, and it works in the same manner.
So does that mean, let's say you're on a lake. You're driving your boat on a lake and you're conducting these seismic methods from the boat, or do you have another device that you send somewhere else?
We have a small boat and the device mounted to it, and then we cover the lake as dense as we can and hopefully pick up some wrecks or whatever there might be.
And I'm going to implement one of our listener questions here already because it fits. And that one says, when imaging shipwrecks, what is the limit in depth? So how deeply can you scan underwater, or is that only limited to shallow regions?
No, it's not limited to shallow regions. You can also image shipwrecks in deep waters. The problem is that the deeper the water is, the less spatial resolution you have. So the image is getting blurry in deeper waters, at least for the sonar systems. If you're doing seismics, then it's not a real problem.
Okay, and how deep can you go? Could you give us an estimate?
Well, as I'm working in very shallow waters, I have only a few examples in deeper waters. And when I talk about deeper waters, it's a few tens of meters. But there are examples from the Black Sea, for example, from other colleagues who work in several hundreds of meters.
Oh, I was just going to say, but not like Titanic deep. But a couple of 100 meters is already quite deep. So, and what are you able to see when you go there? You probably already have an idea of where something could be, because if you think about the areas that the sea covers, you cannot just go there blindly and just scan everything. So you start with an idea, probably archaeological or historical records, and then you scan. And are you really able to see the outline of what we know as a ship, the form of a ship, or is it like
sometimes, yes,
something else? You know,
sometimes it's the outline of a ship, depending on the state of preservation of that wreck. So if you have modern wrecks, like from the Second or First World Wars, then you see the outline quite clearly in most of the cases. If you have older wrecks made of wood, they are usually only destroyed parts left of that wreck. There are only a few unique examples of very defined ship-shaped objects and wrecks.
so that's the imaging part of this archaeological investigation. What are the next steps?
Well, I hand it to the archaeological colleagues, and then they usually go there and dive or use an AUV to go to the wreck, get samples for dating, for example, get finds of interest, pots, weapons, or whatever they can find.
Your work involves not only shipwrecks, but understanding ancient submerged settlements and landscapes. One of your big discoveries was a church of a sunken medieval trading place called Rungholt in the North Sea in Germany. And this settlement drowned in a storm in 1362. The story of its destruction has been mythically exaggerated over the years, and after all this time, you now were able to uncover parts of its remains, including this church that I just mentioned. And in which state was this church, and which other structures were preserved of that settlement?
The state of preservation of all the Rungholt settlement remains is very poor. There's only, we call it a signal layer, which is a bit difficult to explain. It's the old marshland, which is pushed down or was pushed down by constructions like dikes or dwelling mounds and then preserved for the future. And everything the people lived in or on is eroded. And the same accounts for the church. You only have the very base foundation. So if you nowadays observe a construction in a city or somewhere, people are putting sand there before they put the walls. So they do this base foundation, and that's what we found of the church.
That's all that's left. Oh my God.
As far as we know, the excavations are coming in May this year.
I mean, as you said, this was the first time during this talk that you actually shared pictures of the church. And we're waiting for this publication to come out so we can definitely look at what's left. And you also mentioned that the area that you investigated is huge. So how did you know where this church was?
We didn't know. We just stumbled upon it. It was we know the rough area where the settlement was, and we tried to do a systematic prospection, starting with very coarse grid lines of our devices, covering the area, and then we when we find something, we do denser grid lines, imaging it, coming up with dwelling mounds or dikes or drainage ditches, and that's what we've been doing the last 8 years. And last year, in this grid search, the church came out.
8 years is quite a while, but it's a huge project. And sometimes it's true that you have to be at the right time in the right place, and then luck plays a big role. Yeah, obviously. You also mentioned that the conditions under which you're working are not always ideal, including weather and also what you're allowed to do there. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, in terms of the tidal flats and the Rungholt settlement, it's a problem of because it's the Wadden Sea. It's a natural heritage resort, and there are very strict rules how to work there, how to go there, with how many people, with which devices. So you're not allowed to go there with kind of a cart, bike, car, truck, whatever. So you have to carry all your stuff by hand, and only with a few persons, because of natural heritage restrictions.
But the area is huge.
Yeah, that's the problem.
I can see now how the 8 years came together. And I also investigated a Magdalenian occupation in France and did a late Pleistocene landscape reconstruction in a bog in Germany, and are also investigating ancient harbors across the globe. Is there anything that specifically stands out to you? Do you have a favorite project?
Definitely, yes. I mean, every project is interesting in its way, but there are, of course, sites which are legendary. Let's say, for example, Olympia. I was invited by colleagues from Mainz University a few years ago to come to Olympia, do some geophysics, and is an amazing site. And this is one of my favorite projects, I must admit.
Can you tell us more about the site and where it's located and why it's so important?
Well, it was an ancient coming together. It was one of the most important sanctuaries of ancient times, of ancient Greek times. And the site itself is only partly excavated because it was covered by several meters of sediments. So there is some stuff left to find, let's say, in such an important site. And I think everybody knows Olympia.
Yeah, it's definitely very, very famous and well known. And which rights are you dealing there with? Like, I can imagine you cannot just go there and start digging or even measuring stuff with your methods, which are not invasive, but still, I can imagine that there are some restrictions.
Yes, of course. As in every country, there is an archaeological heritage department, ministry, and you have to apply for allowances going there, and it's not easy to get.
I can imagine, especially for such a huge deal like Olympia.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much we can say about this project because I think it's also not fully published. Is that true?
That's true, yes.
Okay, well,
And
we're
it's
going to
not
stop right
fully-
there.
It's not fully understood so far.
Okay, so we're also waiting for this paper to come out. Okay, let's move on to a segment that is called our listener questions. Before you arrived, I went on Instagram and I asked our followers to leave me some questions for you. And we have one here that says, I love that one. I never received a question similar to this. Have you ever found something you just couldn't explain?
That's an interesting question. And the answer is yes, but I have to think about the example. Oh, yes, now I have the example. I remember a magnetometry map made outside of the Viking city of Hedeby, where we have a very large, and when I say large, it's about 30-meter rectangular structure. And this is not very usual for Viking age. And so we're still arguing what that might be. And these kind of anomalies, they pop up quite often when I think about it. Because you have, if you are scanning the ground, you usually have dozens of layers of different times on top of each other. So that might be something modern on top of the Viking Age stuff. So we have to distinguish that. And that's one of the tasks of geophysical prospection and archaeology, to be able to distinguish these different time layers in the subsurface.
That sounds really complicated to do because I don't know how great the resolution is of that. Do you implement other information such as archaeological layers if you have them? Or how do you define which period is which layer?
We of course depend on feedback from archaeological colleagues, from excavations, but also from colleagues doing corings. So they are able to date layers. They are able to depict which kind of soil it is. Is there any anthropogenic fill in there, and so on.
So a coring would be, you take a sample, you take like a huge pipe, you go into the sediments, and you really take out a core of all the layers that are at the site. And then you take it out and investigate that and also date it. So do you have any hints at what this could be?
No idea.
We are leaving a couple of questions open today, but that's good because we could invite you back and maybe do an online podcast to come back and answer all of these. So let's move on to our HEAS quick takes. I already explained to you, we're going to do a rapid fire session. So just answer with the first thought that comes to mind. What's a hobby of yours?
Motorcycles.
There you go. Good answer. Your most and your least favorite subject at school?
The most favorite subject was physics, and the least favorite subject was German.
I knew you were going to say that. I don't know why. Because I feel like there were always these two groups at school who were either good at physics or good at like writing the stories and like doing all the language stuff. So you fall into the physics category. What's one of the best pieces of advice you've ever received?
If you're in a hurry, do it step by step.
I love that. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Definitely flying.
Yeah, that would come in handy in your job when you
Would be helpful.
And also maybe being very strong so you could carry all of your equipment and then fly over and scan everything. If you could live in any archaeological era that you've studied, which one would it be and why?
I think it would be the 19th century because of the fashion.
Of the fashion.
Yeah, I love the fashion of the 19th century.
I did not expect for you to say that. Let's move on to our next quick segment, which is called Speakers Ask Speakers. One of our previous podcast guests has left a question for you, not knowing who they left it for. And it says, do you have any regrets about becoming a scientist? And are there aspects of other careers that you feel like you miss out on by being an academic?
Yes, I never regretted becoming a scientist because it's very interesting work. But I missed out becoming a writer. I like writing. And I don't mean scientific writing. That's a horror, but like creative writing.
You're surprising me again, Dennis, because I just said, from my experience, there were these two groups that either liked writing and being creative or like natural sciences. But here you are, not becoming a writer. You can still do that.
Yeah, I know, but difficult job.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I guess you're very busy as a scientist and you're traveling a lot. And then, as you said, the academical writing part kind of kills off all, at least for myself, it really kills the motivation to write even more, even if it's a hobby. Maybe you can do that when you're retired.
I hope so.
If people would like to know more about you, want to read your papers, your work, where can people find you online?
They can find me online via the University of Kiel website.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's it.
No social media handles?
Well, we are in our institute. We are just starting it, so we're a bit back in time with that.
When did the institute start, and how long have you been working there?
I'm working there since 15 years, something, and the Instagram page was started a few weeks ago.
Oh, so that's what you meant. Okay,
yeah.
Got it. I thought you were saying that the institute is quite new.
No,
But
the
yeah.
institute is very old.
Is there anything you would like to add to this conversation? Anything you feel like we haven't talked about enough, or anything you would have liked me to ask you?
No, it would just be a question to your followers, because I'm interested how visible geophysical work or geophysical prospection is in public. I think it's not very well known.
Just when we started the chat, I told you I think this is going to be a good conversation because I'm not very familiar with those techniques. So, and it's a good question. I mean, people out there, I'm going to create a poll at the end of this podcast. So the people who are listening can drop their answers into this box on Spotify. I'm going to see how to do that on YouTube. But yeah, none of my guests ever left a question for our listeners. So thanks for that, Dennis. And also, thank you so much for this great talk today. I really learned a lot.